The Iran collar around Yusuf's neck was not the heaviest thing he carried. He had worn the collar for 3 years, ever since the raiders swept through his village in the hills east of the great river, torching the grain stores and leading away the able-bodied in chains. He had learned not to think about the collar. He had learned not to think about his mother's face, or the sound his younger sister made when they dragged him past her. You survive by forgetting. That was the first lesson of captivity. No, the heaviest thing Yusuf carried was the knowledge that he had stopped praying. Not because he had lost faith. Faith was one of the last things the masters couldn't take. Though they tried. He had stopped because prayer required hope, and hope had become the most dangerous luxury he knew. A man who hopes can be broken in ways a man who has surrendered cannot. He had watched it happen to others. They prayed for rescue, for mercy, for a sign, and when none came, the silence from the heavens crushed them completely. Yusuf had decided that silence was preferable to that kind of collapse. But on the first morning of the 30th month of his captivity, something shifted. He was drawing water from the well in the courtyard of the merchant Khalid al-Rashid's estate in the city of Qaisar when he heard the old woman singing. She was one of the household's elderly servants, not a slave, but a free woman of modest means who worked for her bread. Her name was Dawood, and she was famous in the estate for two things: her extraordinary flatbread and her habit of singing while she worked. On most mornings, Yusuf tuned her out the way he tuned out everything that wasn't immediately useful for survival. But that morning, her song reached him. It was an old devotional melody, the kind that grandmothers hum over sleeping infants, and the words were simple. You who hear the reeds cry from afar, come close. The one who is lost is never truly lost to you. Yusuf stood at the well with the rope in his hands and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly, something smaller and more stubborn, a splinter of something that refused to be pulled out. He set down the water bucket and, for the first time since his capture, he prayed. It was barely a prayer, 2 short lines, muttered under his breath so none of the other servants would hear. He felt foolish doing it. He expected nothing. But he had done it, and that, though he didn't know it yet, was the beginning. Khalid al-Rashid was not a cruel man. This made him, in some ways, more difficult to hate than a cruel man would have been. He fed his slaves adequately, did not beat them without cause, and prided himself on running an orderly household. He was a merchant of spices and dyed cloth, moderately wealthy, moderately respected, moderately content with his moderately just life. He owned 11 slaves. He thought of them approximately the way he thought of his mules, with a practical concern for their upkeep and no particular malice. Yusuf had been purchased in a lot with 2 others, recommended by the trader for his literacy and his skill with accounts. And that skill, that single surviving fragment of Yusuf's former life, was the thread from which everything else would eventually hang. Yusuf had been educated by his father, a village schoolmaster who had traded in goats and knowledge with equal pride. By the age of 12, Yusuf could read 3 scripts, calculate compound interest, and recite enough poetry to embarrass men twice his age. These gifts had seemed ornamental in the village. In captivity, Khalid had discovered them accidentally when Yusuf corrected an arithmetic error in the estate's accounts. Not defiantly, but out of a reflex too old and deep to suppress. Khalid had been surprised, then curious, then quietly calculating in his own right. But none of that had changed Yusuf's status. Useful slaves were still slaves. By the 7th day, Yusuf was wakened before the household to pray in the cold dark of the slave quarters. He didn't know what he was praying for. He hadn't yet dared to formulate a specific request. That still felt too much like hope, too much like exposure. Instead, he prayed the way a man bails water from a sinking boat. Not because he was sure it would save him, but because stopping felt worse than continuing. By the 14th day, something had changed in how he moved through the world. The other slaves noticed it first. A young man named Faris, who slept on the mat beside Yusuf's, asked him one evening why he seemed different. Yusuf thought about the question for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he said. "I think I've stopped waiting for something to happen to me. I've started." He paused, searching for the word. Watching, looking, as if the answer might already be somewhere in what I can see. Faris snorted. "The answer to what?" "I don't know that either." But it was true. Yusuf had begun to pay attention in a different way. Not the hyper-vigilant attention of the newly enslaved, who scanned every room for threats, but a quieter, more patient noticing. He watched Khalid's household like a man reading a text for the second time, looking for things he'd missed. What he found surprised him. Khalid's eldest son, a young man of 20 named Tariq, was running the business into the ground, not through malice or stupidity, but through inexperience and an unfortunate tendency to trust flatterers. Yusuf had seen the accounts. He knew that 2 of the estate's most important trade agreements were built on faulty projections, that a shipment of saffron being held in a warehouse to the south was quietly spoiling, and that a loan taken out 6 months ago had terms that would begin to bite in less than a season. Khalid, distracted by his own comforts and his increasing age, hadn't seen it. Tariq didn't know enough to see it. Yusuf saw it. He spent 3 nights composing in his head a complete analysis of the estate's financial situation. He had no paper, no pen. Those weren't given to slaves without reason. He memorized every figure he had ever handled, built the picture from memory, the way his father had taught him to memorize verses, through rhythm and repetition and structural understanding. Then he went to prayer on the 21st day and asked for the first time for something specific, not freedom. He didn't dare ask for freedom. He asked for the courage to speak. The opportunity came 2 days later, neither miraculously nor conveniently, but through the small chaos of ordinary life. Tariq al-Rashid was in the courtyard berating a supplier over a discrepancy in a delivery. The supplier was red-faced and defensive. Tariq was wrong. Yusuf could see it in the numbers Tariq was citing, which didn't account for a commission adjustment that had been agreed the previous quarter. The supplier knew he was right, but lacked the documentation to prove it quickly. The argument was growing ugly. Yusuf set down the crate he was carrying and spoke. "Forgive me." His voice was steady. "The commission adjustment from the quarter prior reduces the expected delivery by 14 bolts. The supplier's count is correct." The courtyard went silent. Tariq turned and stared at him. The supplier stared at him. 2 other servants froze where they stood. Yusuf met Tariq's eyes and did not look away. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Tariq, slowly, carefully, pulled out the relevant document from the folder he was holding and read it. His expression shifted through several stages: irritation, confusion, comprehension, something that might have been shame. "He's right," Tariq said finally, to no one in particular. He looked at Yusuf for a long moment, then he turned away and resolved the dispute quietly, professionally, without further argument. That evening, Tariq summoned Yusuf to the study. The study smelled of cedar and old ink. Tariq sat behind his father's desk with the careful posture of a young man trying to look more certain than he felt. "You work in the yard?" Tariq said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "Before that, you were in the warehouse?" "Yes." "My father bought you because you could read accounts?" "Yes." Tariq was quiet for a moment. "Can you do more than read them? Can you understand them, analyze them?" Yusuf thought of his 30 days. He thought of the prayer that had asked for courage, not comfort. "Yes," he said, "and there are things in your father's accounts that you should know about." He told Tariq everything. Not carefully, not strategically, not with any plan beyond honesty. He laid out the spoiling saffron, the dangerous loan terms, the flawed trade agreements, the flatterers who were costing the estate quietly and systematically. He spoke for almost an hour, from memory, with the precision of a man who has had 3 weeks to organize his thoughts. When he finished, Tariq sat in silence for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" he said, finally. Yusuf thought about the question. "Because it needed to be said, and because I can say it. You know I could punish you for speaking without being asked, for knowing things you shouldn't." "Yes." Another silence. Then Tariq said, "What would you do? If you were me, what would you do first?" And that was when Yusuf understood that the conversation had become something else entirely. They worked through the night, Yusuf and Tariq, spreading papers across the cedar desk and tracing the estate's situation by candlelight. Yusuf wrote. Tariq had given him paper and a pen without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And Tariq read and questioned and pushed back, and gradually began to understand the shape of the problem he had inherited without fully knowing it. By dawn, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan, not a guaranteed one, but a real one. The saffron could still be salvaged if sold at a discount within the week. The loan could be renegotiated if approached before the terms kicked in, which required moving immediately. The flawed trade agreements could be revised through honest conversation with partners who, Yusuf suspected, were already uneasy about them. Khalid al-Rashid was summoned by his son that morning. He came into the study frowning, prepared to be annoyed, and found instead his son seated across from a slave, both of them looking tired and alert in the way people look when they have been working rather than worrying. Tariq showed his father the documents. He showed him the analysis. He showed him the plan. Khalid read it all slowly, twice. Then he looked at Yusuf. "This is your work." Tariq led the thinking, Yusuf said carefully. "I provided the analysis." Khalid was quiet for a very long time. He was not, as has been said, a cruel man. He was also not, when the moment demanded it, a foolish one. "What do you want?" he asked Yusuf, directly, as if Yusuf were a person whose wants were a legitimate subject of inquiry. The question undid something in Yusuf's chest. He had spent 3 years not allowing himself to want things. He had spent 30 days learning slowly how to want again. "My freedom," he said, The word felt enormous in the room. And a position. I want to work. I want to use what I know. I don't want charity. I want a fair arrangement, a contract, wages, the ability to send money to my family if they can be found. Khalid looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Tariq. He saved us a considerable sum, Tariq said quietly. And we haven't acted on any of his suggestions yet. Khalid set down the documents. He rubbed his face with both hands, an old man's gesture, a tired man's gesture. If we implement this plan, he said, and it works, if the saffron is sold, the loan renegotiated, the agreements repaired. He paused. What will that be worth? To you? Everything, Yusuf said. It would be worth everything. The saffron sold within 4 days at a price that, while reduced, avoided total loss. The loan was renegotiated successfully. The creditor, it turned out, had been nervous about the terms himself and was relieved to revise them. 2 of the 3 trade agreements were adjusted. The third had to be dissolved, but the partner in question had been about to propose the same thing anyway. It took 40 days in total. 40 days from Yusuf's first prayer to the morning Khalid al-Rashid called him into the study again, alone this time, without Tariq, and set a document on the desk between them. It was a deed of manumission, freedom papers, properly witnessed, legally binding. Beside it was a second document, a contract of employment, Chief Accounting Officer of the Al-Rashid Trading House, with a salary, a percentage of profits, and a clause about annual review. I won't pretend this is purely generosity, Khalid said. It isn't. You're worth more to me as a free employee than as a slave who has every reason to hide what he knows. I'm not a saint. I'm a merchant. I know, Yusuf said, but I am also... Khalid paused. I am also aware that I did not treat you as a man. I'm aware of that now. I'm not sure what to do with that awareness except to acknowledge it. Yusuf looked at the documents. He thought about 30 days of prayer. He thought about what he had asked for, not for rescue, but for the courage to speak. He had never asked to be saved by someone else's goodness. He had asked only to be brave enough to use what he already had. Thank you, he said, and meant it without simplicity, without resentment, without performance. He signed the employment contract first. Then he picked up the freedom papers and held them for a moment before folding them carefully and placing them inside his robe, against his chest. Yusuf went on to serve the Al-Rashid House for 11 years, by which time the modest estate had become one of the most respected trading operations in the region. He eventually negotiated his way into partnership, found 2 of his 3 siblings still living, and built a house on the edge of the city, where he kept a room always set aside for travelers, with nowhere to sleep. He never stopped praying, but his prayers changed over the years, became less about asking and more about listening, less about wanting and more about noticing. He taught his children that prayer is not a mechanism for changing the world, but a practice for changing how you see it, and that changed sight is the beginning of changed circumstance. People asked him sometimes about the 30 days. They wanted the story to be a story about God rescuing him, or about goodness being rewarded, or about patience eventually being vindicated. He understood why they wanted that. It's a better story that way, cleaner, more comforting, easier to carry. But when he told it truthfully, this is what he said. The prayer did not bring me a rescuer. It brought me back to myself. and I, myself awake, paying attention, unafraid to speak. I did the rest. That is also, I think, how it is meant to work. The reed cries from the reed bed. The distance between where you are and where you might be is not always as vast as it looks from the inside. Sometimes it is crossed not by rescue, but by a single act of courage. One morning at a well, one voice in a courtyard, one honest accounting of what you see. Begin there.